Hey Brian, how you doing, man?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
Pretty good. How's your week been?
Oh, it's been great actually. Yesterday, a bunch of friends had a barbecue, and a group of us are doing this book reading for what's it called? The Four Cardinal Virtues, which so happens to be what we're talking about in the podcast. It was a good discussion, and we had a good time.
I don't know what I'm more excited about, the barbecue or the virtue, but they're both good in my book. What's the weather like up there? Is it scorching hot summer weather yet?
It's getting there. It's in the mid 80s today for I think the first time this year, or at least it's getting up there for on a regular basis, which I am not appreciating.
Yeah, me either. But anyway, gents, welcome to the Vital Masculinity podcast, and we could continue doing some summer posting, but I think we'll probably move on to the episode if that's okay with you, Brian.
Yep, that sounds good.
All right, so tonight we're going to kind of expand on our last episode, which was the introduction of virtue. And we hope that the last episode provided you with a good foundation for what virtue is, but now we want to talk about why you should be virtuous. And this is a much deeper topic than I think one may think at face value. But to start, Brian, would you like to give us a quick refresher on what virtue is that we talked about last time?
Yeah, so I guess first off, I would say go listen to the episode because there's going to be a lot more details there. But if we want to just think of virtue, it's a good habit. It's a habit of doing good things, doing what's right, what's true. Kind of like, think, what is the right thing to do in this situation? How should I act? What is the true way to act? And another way you can look at it is virtue is about being a man.
Yeah, no, for sure. If you go back to Latin and the Roman Empire, then we can see in the language itself that the Latin word for virtue or manliness or character is virtus, virtus, and the Latin word for man is vir, vir. So they're intrinsically linked going back thousands of years, which is just an interesting tidbit that I think vastly relates to our discussion here.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think some people might be wondering, though, if the root of the word of virtue is, about manliness. Well, can't women act virtuous too? So what's the deal?
Oh, for sure. It's not that when we're talking about vital masculinity, it's not that women are not virtuous beings or capable of virtue or whatever it is, and it's not even that they have different virtues per se. In the same way that if fortitude's a courage for men, that it's not a virtue for women. I think at the end of the day, it's just a matter of how men and women have traditionally pursued virtue, the virtues that they favored, and really also the pitfalls that have come with the pursuit of virtue. For instance, men a lot of times will put a lot of stock in fortitude and courage at the expense of maybe prudence in situations. Kind of vigilante justice would be a great example of this.
Right. Yeah, you think of like, okay, I'm going to get revenge here. I'm going to be courageous. And a lot of times when people think of courageous, it's not, okay, well, courageous plus, figuring out what the right thing to do is here. What's the just thing to do? Am I going crazy or do I have control over myself? You don't kind of look at those together and, okay, maybe you're being courageous, but maybe you're being foolish too. And so, like we talked about last week, these virtues all tie together. And so, when you only look at one in by itself, that's not necessarily going to be virtuous if you forget the other ones.
Right. And I think Aristotle would even go as far to say that since virtues are intrinsically linked to our being, to who we are as people, and this gets back to kind of an old anthropology that you really find in kind of Greek thought and Christian thought way before modern times, that you can't just have one virtue, otherwise your entire being is out of balance, out of whack, which you don't want to go to the gym and only work on the right side of your arm and only have one really large bicep and then the other one be really atrophied, because like that we want to be well-rounded men, or I would hope you would want to be well-rounded men if you're listening to this.
Right. Yeah, so I think the key there is that men pursue virtue in different ways. They have different focuses that they have on virtue, and also different challenges that they have to, because they focus on certain ones like fortitude, for example. So I think we could talk a lot about this, and I think we're going to do a different episode on specifically the difference between men and women's pursuit of virtue later on. So why don't we go back to kind of the original topic and say, why should someone be virtuous? Like, okay, it's about being a better man, it's about doing good things, but why?
Yeah. So that's a good question, because I think we really need to first, you and me, Brian, step into the shoes of probably a lot of our listeners and really a lot of the men that are out there today. As we've had discussions in the Facebook group and we've had discussions among ourselves, and really when you just look out into the world, you see a lot of men are listless. A lot of men, there's the classical trope of living in your parents' basement. They don't start. They have a lot of mental health issues. They have a lot of physical health issues, and their characters are not well developed. And because of this, they don't really have a sense of purpose. They don't have a sense of order. They don't really have a sense of clarity in their life either. And as we talked about in the first episode, virtue isn't done for the sake of getting something like a reward. But I think that, first of all, for these men in particular, if they start the pursuit of virtue and they really put themselves on that path, it will bring purpose, it will bring clarity, and it will bring order to their life, something that was vastly missing and that very much contributed to some of these symptoms that I just said.
Right. So I think that makes sense. Like, we want to have purpose, we want order, we want clarity, we don't want to be confused about things. But at the same time, like, I'm sure there's men out there that, maybe not the men listening to this podcast, but in general, it's like, okay, well, why do I need a purpose? Why do I need order? Like, why can't I just do whatever I want to do?
And that's a good question. In the modern world, we have plenty of comforts that I think make people not want to ask a lot of these questions because they just don't need to. We're not out there on the front lines of life every day having to deal with, foraging for food, the potential of dying from a little cut on our finger or things like that. So our lives are vastly different from the people that kind of came up with a lot of these questions. We don't live in, 5th century BC Athens. So I think when you ask these questions, I think the best way to kind of look at it is, well, I would hope you do, first of all. I would hope that you want to have purpose, order, and clarity. And if you don't, then I'll be a little bit brash and say that I think you're failing at life, and more particularly, you're failing at being a man. Because if you don't have some ulterior goal in life, if you don't have your telos, if you don't have, a mission, to use military terms, then what are you doing? Are you just going home and you're watching TV and playing video games all day? What are you doing with your life that gives it some sense of meaning? And I think that's probably at least my response. Brian, you may have a little more genteel response to that.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking that I don't think a lot of people think about this, or they even have time to think about this. Not that they're not intelligent, not that there's something wrong with them, but we're just so inundated with there isn't any scarcity of experiences, of things we can, consume. Like, I can go to the store, I can get anything I want to eat. I can go online, I can watch anything I want. I can, there's millions of games and fun things to do, and there's 24/7 news. Like, there's all these things going on. And so when do I have time to even think about, like, why should I have a purpose? Why, like, the world seems like there's no order to it. There's just, there's stuff all over the place, and it just keeps coming and coming. And but I think after a while, that gets tiring. Like, you can't deal with all this stuff. You can't, you have to make choices. You can't. I mean, I suppose you could, but you get tired out. Like, for example, you're trying to take in all the news that's out there. It's impossible. There's too many sources. There's too many reporters. There's people on blogs. There's you'd have to sit there. You'd have to make it your full-time job. And just the same with everything. I think people tend to get tired, and when they get tired, they take a step back, and they get some space, some time to think to themselves. And I think that's where you come to the point where you say, what am I doing with my life? What is the point of all these things? And I think a man has to kind of come to that point one way or another before they can even think about, I need some purpose in my life. I need direction. I'm confused. I need to know where I need to go. And I think that's what we're offering here with virtue.
Yeah, that point, that crossroads about, what path do I pursue? What am I doing with my life? I think everyone, man or woman in the modern world, faces that nowadays, because a lot of our modern economy is really to kind of break you down and view you as, a cog in a machine. And that analogy isn't exactly perfect. I hate it because it's very, very rough, but still I think that's a very good point that a lot of people are feeling nowadays. A lot of people have issues with mental health that come up because of this. And you see it particularly among men, which is a group of people. Well, a group of people. It's the gender that typically likes to keep things inside. And this is why so many men are struggling, I think, very silently and living lives of quiet desperation. So if you're living a life of quiet desperation, it doesn't mean that you're going to be there forever, and it doesn't mean that the world's against you. What we're doing here at Vital Masculinity is that we're trying to take what our ancestors thought when they still had to think about a lot of the tough questions, a lot of the moral questions, a lot of the ethical questions, and we're trying to say that for those of you that are living those lives of quiet desperation, that this can be an antidote for you. And this can be a way out. And it's not perfect. It's not a magic pill, because as we talked about before, we are against magic pills because they don't work. We're not trying to peddle you some method or some, we're not snake oil salesmen here. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to help put you on a path that you will most undoubtedly become a better man in so undertaking that journey.
Yeah, that reminds me, I was talking to one of my friends the other night. He might even be listening to this podcast. And he said he came across some men's rights activists. I don't know if you ever heard of those.
I have. They're a fun group of people.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, they do make some good points. Like, there certainly is entitlements for, for example, if I'm looking for a job and I'm a software engineer. I went to school, and software engineering, my major was 70 men to every one woman. So it was pretty imbalanced, and because we need these quotas to get more women into there, I guarantee if it was me or a woman, they would have chose the woman. And that's just kind of how it is. But it's not fair. But at the same time, and there's lots of things like that. So I'm not saying that those things are right. But I guess what I am saying is there's just looking at that, there's a lot of things in society that let's figure out ways to help women, to uplift women, to make sure that women have a better opportunity, and that's great. But I think part of the challenge for men is that there's so much focus on women, on all these different groups, gay people, minorities, whoever it might be, that your average man, especially like an average white man, they might say like, what about me? Like, what is my purpose? Like, what should I be looking for? And a lot of times the response to this is, to get upset, say, okay, there's a problem with the world, and yeah, the world's not perfect, but what we're here to do is to say, okay, maybe there's a problem with the world, but in order to change the world, you got to start somewhere, and the one thing that we know we have control over is ourselves. So if you can start to order your own world and to become a better man yourself, then these problems that you are noticing are things you're going to be able to deal with a lot better than is if you just look at them and say, okay, this stinks, and I don't know what I'm going to do about it except to complain to people and hope that something changes.
Yeah, and that's definitely an issue. When you're putting the locus of control outside of yourself, that's when a lot of people start to kind of take on those feelings of helplessness because you're waiting for someone else to act, and that's a very unmanly thing. But Brian, continuing what you were, talking about, how this is something that, a lot of people can turn to when times are tough, like they are now for a lot of people. I think at the end of the day, whether you're trying to pursue virtue, whether you're trying to be a good man, whatever that means for you, anything that's you're going to do, you're going to run into tough times. And it could be something personal. It could be something impersonal. It could be something small. It could be something big. But the path of virtue, I'll paint a picture. I think that may be a better idea. If you're someone that's committed yourself for, let's say, 90 days to kind of improving yourself with regards to the four cardinal virtues, becoming more just, becoming more prudent, becoming more temperate, and becoming more courageous. If you're doing that and actively undergoing the steps that we're going to be talking about in later episodes with regards to these virtues, then a lot of your life is going to be oriented around it. We have our daily deeds, which are your 5 or 10 minutes a day, even 2 minutes a day, which will help get you on the right track. But this is really, kind of a lifestyle change. This is a lot more than, if you're going to the gym 5 or 7 times a week or, whatever it may be, because really what you're doing then is you're working on one aspect of yourself, which is your body. And that's an important aspect of yourself that men, you should be going to the gym and working out. But your character and really your being, kind of going back to the Aristotelian notion of being as related to the virtues and having that sense of balance, that's a lot bigger than just, your biceps. So when you're undertaking this way of life and you're starting to build these habits, going back to the example, if something comes up, if someone throws a wrench in your life on day 15 of this 90-day challenge, you're going to be able to respond a lot better because you know what to do the next day. You know what to do even later that day if you have a set of steps, a set of things to meditate on, a set of things to read, a set of things to implement in your life, as compared to if you're just like, what am I going to do tonight? Maybe I'll go to Dairy Queen, maybe I'll watch Netflix for 3 hours. And that's really important because that also kind of helps to solve a lot of the issues that come about when men don't have a purpose. I mean, that is your purpose in life. It's self-help and that kind of self-improvement sphere is in many senses a hobby. But I think it's definitely a worthwhile hobby for men to undertake, particularly in this manner that we're talking about.
Right. So what would you say to the man, and I think, get ready because this might be a tough one. What do you say to the man who, okay, he's doing pretty well, he's raising a family, he's making good money, and he's doing like kind of all the right things, but for whatever reason, his wife says, I don't like you anymore. I'm taking the kids. Oh, and on top of this, you need to pay, you need to pay child support. Oh, and you can't see him more than like once a month. That really stinks. Like, how is someone supposed to find purpose in, this horrible situation?
It's funny you bring that up as an example because I was in the gym 2 nights ago and I overheard basically this exact conversation, and the dollar amounts were unfortunately very, very high. And the man was not reacting well to the scenario at all. He was being very unjust, to use a term. And but yeah, this is a common position that I think a lot of men unfortunately will find themselves in their life. And for men that are in this position, really you always have to kind of, take a term from Jocko, you always have to kind of accept extreme ownership. You need to take the responsibility on yourself because there's a chance that, maybe your ex-wife was crazy and maybe she ruined your relationship and she ruined your marriage. But there's a chance, and there's a very, very likely chance that you played a part in it. You could have been a very suave man when you guys were dating, and then you could have just started completely ignoring her after you got married and she had children and that sort of thing. Or, maybe you just started working, 60, 70 hours a week, and you were thinking you were doing the right thing for your family, but you weren't actually spending time with your family. You weren't there having that face-to-face contact, and that can also cause people to drift apart and relationships to fall apart. And that's another issue. And really, it's just so important that we take responsibility for our lives as men. If you're not going to take responsibility for your life, again, what are you doing with your life? Are you just waiting for someone else, to push you along, to wheel you from place to place and you're just kind of going with the flow, yeah, that's a lot less stress, but you're also not going to really get anywhere. You're just going to kind of let life toss you around. So we don't want that. We want to take responsibility for our lives. We want to take extreme ownerships, because I love Jocko's quote. And it's important to start with ourselves. It's important to look at what, the ways that our ancestors would respond to hardship, which, as we talked about, is virtue. It's so intrinsically linked for centuries and for millennia, this conception of manliness and virtue, this conception of manliness and good character, of good, just well-being in general, that if we were to completely ignore it and say that, nowadays being a man is just going to the gym, is to very much atrophy the definition of masculinity and manliness that has been handed down. And it's unfortunate that we are in that position. But anyway, Brian, I hope that answered your question.
Not exactly, but I think it was pretty close. And I guess what I would just add to that is that, well, let's say, for example, the man, okay, so more than likely, there's something he probably could have done to mitigate this situation before it got to this point. But let's just say, maybe it was not his fault at all. Like, what's the response to that? And I think that what you said is the response, whether or not it's your fault, is you need to take responsibility and take ownership of it. Okay, maybe it was completely this other person's fault. I think that's probably unlikely, but maybe it's the case. But in reality, when it comes down to it, what are you going to do? You can't control what happens to you in life. You can't control, everything that's going to happen to you. And so you can say, okay, I'm going to be virtuous. Bad things are going to happen, and, that's just part of life. But regardless of what happens, whether it's good or bad, I'm going to choose to be good. I'm going to choose to do the right thing. I'm going to choose to be mature. I'm going to choose to be a man. And no matter what situation comes across, you can always do that. And that always gives you a sense of purpose and direction and clarity, because you know what the good thing is to do. You know what the right thing is to do. And that's something that you can always do, whether or not things are going great.
Right. And that's important, because at the end of the day, we're also trying to avoid casuistry, which is, those set of rules that you just kind of blindly follow and expect to have a good life. And then we'll talk about that in later episodes for sure. But kind of moving on. So Brian, we've talked about a lot of kind of like the byproducts of, pursuing virtue, kind of having a little more sense of purpose, which is a really big one. Having a sense of order in your life, knowing what to do when things are going right and when things are going wrong. But, you and I have also talked privately and also mentioned on the last episode that in many ways you can really only know kind of the true power of virtue in one's own life when you're actually pursuing it. It's kind of hard to think of reasons beforehand. And why do you think that is?
That's a good question. So, I mean, if you think about like virtue as being good, it's being right, it's following what is true. And okay, yeah. So what does that mean? Like, why do I want to do those things? Like, if I'm gonna be good, like, what am I gonna get out of it? And okay, that's a great question. But if you don't know what it looks like to live in this way, if you don't, so how are you going to know what you're going to get out of it if you don't know what it looks like to live in that way? I guess maybe we could use the example of running. I used to run cross country, and most times you think of, like, a lot of people are like, I hate running. Why would I want to run? And yeah, when I first started, I was like, why do I want to run? Okay, maybe I want to get into shape. So, okay, maybe I'll run, and then maybe I'll run until I get in shape. But, like, what happens after that? But it's funny because a lot of people think, like, I hate running because, like, it makes me feel horrible. Like, I feel tired, my legs hurt, I'm sore, I'm running, I'm out of breath, I can't breathe, all these different things. But after a while, you recognize something. You're running in and day out. You've built up this endurance, and maybe you take a day off, and then you're like, whoa, I didn't run today. something's missing from my life, and it's kind of hard to recognize. You can't see what you're missing out on until you've kind of experienced it, I guess, is what I would have to say.
Yeah, it goes back to the old parental adage of "try it, you'll like it" with regards to children and vegetables. But I think that's very true here.
That makes me think of this movie, The Life of Father, which is a great movie. It's kind of a little old fashioned, but there's this kid sitting at the table, and they're having breakfast, and he says, "I don't like oatmeal," and his father says, "You don't like oatmeal? You're 3 years old. What do you know? I will tell you what you like."
We'll link to that in the show notes, because now I would like to watch that movie since I've never seen it. But yeah, I love the analogy you used of running, because really at the end of the day, I love the analogy of running. I love the analogy of Crossroads. And you're at a crossroads, and you're either going towards, truth and beauty and goodness, which really is the path of virtue, or you're going towards kind of ugliness, same old, a lot of other things, and I can come up with a lot of awesome adjectives for that. But really, at the end of the day, try it, you'll like it is a great reason to is a great selling point on virtue. Because honestly, don't take it from us. Look at the thousands of men, the millions of men from the past that have undertaken this journey. You remember them today, and it's not just your Plato and your Socrates and your Aristotle, but it's also if you're a Christian, you have thousands of Christian saints that pursued this path particularly, and live exemplary lives of virtue that we can emulate. This isn't just something about like, oh, I think this would be a good idea, Brian. We should do this. I don't know how we do it, but we do have these guides in so many different forms across so many different countries and cultures that we can turn to say, hey, I think that I should do this.
Right. Yeah, and I was thinking of, I know there's this book that you like, and I've enjoyed it as well, called Call of the Wild, I think, right? Oh, shoot.
That is correct.
Is that what it's called? That guy, what's his name? It's
Eldridge?
about, no, Wild at Heart. Wild
at Heart. Okay, that's what I was thinking you meant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Call of the Wild is also a good book, but not the same one. Not the same one I was thinking of. But I think so. It talks about like there's something deep down in every man that we have this desire to be wild, to have an adventure, to be on a mission. And I think that when you're so caught up in the world, when you're so distracted by all the things that are going on, when you don't take time to step back, you can kind of lose sight of that. But I think when you do take that time, every man realizes that they have a desire to have some sort of mission to follow, and that mission is their purpose. And in order to follow a mission, you need to have order. You need to follow a plan. You need to know what you're looking for, what goals you want to achieve, and by doing that, that brings clarity. So that's kind of what we're talking about. Is we have this desire deep down, whether we realize it or not. And if you don't think you do, I encourage you to take some time and to think about, what am I doing with my life? What am I here for? What do I want to achieve in life? And I think that you'll realize that it is there when you just take the time to look at it. But
is that the daily deed for today?
It might be. We didn't really talk about one beforehand, but maybe that will be the daily deed. But yeah, I think that it's something that maybe you don't realize that's what you need. But I think, like we said, when you take time to reflect, when you try it, when you say, okay, I'm going to give this a shot. Like, I don't know what's going on. I'm just doing whatever I feel like. Why don't we take some time to, figure out, I'm going to, maybe it's just a mini mission. Maybe it's not my life's mission, but it's a mission that I can go on, and then just see where it takes you. And I think you'll be surprised.
Yeah. And Brian, I think I may hijack this daily deed a bit. And at least this is the Stephen Sloyer daily deed. You can have your own at the end of the show.
Okay.
But I think what you said about, kind of taking that time, I think that's honestly a great thing. I've done that many times. Maybe once a year I'll go to a coffee shop, or I'll go to a park, and I'll just spend 4 or 5 hours there, and I'll just kind of think about where I'm at in my life and where I'm going. I'll think about, I'll make like a checklist of character is what I call it. And I'll kind of, see how have I improved, how have I regressed. And this is all kind of the summation of doing this day by day, week by week, month by month. It's not just, I'm like, I wonder how I did last year. But I would say go ahead and do that. In the next couple of weeks, definitely before the end of our giveaway on July 21st, then go ahead, spend a Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop or in your favorite park and just kind of think about where you are in your life. Think about, where you want to be. Think about how well you've done with your character, how well you've done in other aspects of your life, like technical and interpersonal aspects, and really focus on that and see if you can kind of, come up with a summary of things you do well, things you do poorly. And then also go ahead and share that in our Facebook group and we can have a conversation, about what it means to be a man, building off of that. And I'm sure that your own analysis of your life will be an inspiration to many other people in our growing Facebook group.
Right. Yeah, so I think I'd like to, maybe we can wrap it up after this, but I think I'd like to share the analogy of Plato's cave. And maybe some of you have heard this. I'm trying to remember this, so you might have to correct me. But basically, Plato has this idea of, or I guess there's this cave, and these men are chained up in here, and it's they're far into the cave. It's dark. They can't really see anything, but there's light shining in, and they see shadows of things like going past the opening of the cave, and I guess one point to point out is that they've lived in this cave this whole life. They've never been able to leave. This is all they know. All they know is the shadows. That's all that. So they when they see the shadows, they're like, oh, well, this is normal. This is the real world. They can't even see the man next to them. So all they know of the world is the shadows that they see, which, as we know, if they were to leave that cave, there's a lot more to it than these two-dimensional shadows on the side of the cave wall. And that's kind of what living in a virtuous life is like. You can't really see what is true and what is good until you start living with virtue. And then when you do, things start to become clearer. The light, you start to enter into the light of day, so to speak. You can see more clearly why it's good to live this way, what is true about it, and then from there you'll be able to appreciate even more. Because I think part of the thing with growing with virtue is a lot of times you start from it as like, okay, this seems like a good idea. I don't know. I'm not really sure if it'll work, but I'll give it a shot. And then you do, and then after a while you start to actually desire to live that way. And that's kind of where you really start to grow in virtue is you're actually appreciating these things in your life. And through that, you can start to see even more clearly.
Absolutely. I really do love that analogy because I think it's, first of all, it's a very common one, but also that it's just a great example of the pursuit of virtue.
I would just finish off maybe with one last thing. So we're talking about, taking a look at your life. And a lot of people have heard the quote from Socrates that says, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think that's definitely true. But this famous philosopher, Mortimer Adler, commenting on Aristotle, said Aristotle kicks it up a notch, and he would essentially say the unplanned life is not worth examining. So if we think about this, you want to examine your life, but if you don't have a plan for that, if you don't have a plan, a mission to follow, and I think we are suggesting that mission should be to live a virtuous life. If you don't have that, then okay, maybe you're examining it, but what's the point? Like if there's no plan, like, okay, well, I'm looking at this, now what? So take a look, take some time, think about it, and join us as we plan on growing in virtue.
There you go. Is that the daily deed?
I think so.
There we go. Well, we're gonna make a note of that on our website as well with the rest of the show notes. And our website, for those that are interested, is vitalmasculinity.org. You can continue to join the conversation, which is growing, and we've been having some great conversations every day, Brian. It's great to see the level of content that has been being discussed in the group. But our Facebook group, if you go to facebook.com/groups/vital masculinity, you can also search for us there. And the last thing is we would love for you to leave us a rating and review and give us some honest feedback into how we're doing. It really helps us kind of, direct this show going forward so that we can make sure we're providing the best content and also making the best quality for you to help you all become better men. But thank you again for listening to this show. Please check out all those things I just mentioned, and I hope that you have a great rest of your week. And remember, virtue makes the man.